She had everything money could buy, except her son's trust. So the billionaire's mother traded her diamonds for a maid's apron and walked into her own son's mansion as a stranger. She wanted to see who his fiancée really was when no one important was watching. What she found in the shadows of that house had nothing to do with greed. It was darker, older, and closer to home than she ever imagined. By the time she uncovered the truth, it would be too late to simply walk away. If you love a story where nothing is what it seems, hit subscribe and like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Eleanor Whitfield had built an empire out of steel and patience, and in 71 years, she had learned to trust exactly two things: numbers and her own eyes. Everything else, promises, smiles, wedding toasts, she had learned to hold at arm's length. Her son Marcus was the one soft place left in her armor. He was 34, sharp as she'd raised him to be, and utterly, helplessly in love. "You've known her 4 months," Eleanor said, standing at the window of her Manhattan penthouse, watching the lights of the city blur into gold smears against the glass. "4 months is enough to know, Mum." Marcus loosened his tie, that easy smile on his face, the one that had closed 1,000 deals and, apparently, 1 heart. "Isabelle isn't like anyone I've ever met. That's exactly what worries me." Isabelle Renard had arrived in Marcus's life, the way storms arrive in summer. Sudden, beautiful, impossible to ignore. She was 28, elegant in the effortless way that made other women's effort look cheap, and she came from money that nobody could quite trace. Old family, she said. European, mostly. Discreet. Eleanor had hired investigators. Discreet, indeed almost suspiciously so. Isabelle's past unspooled cleanly, too cleanly, like a story rehearsed until the seams disappeared. "I'm not asking you to distrust her," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm asking you to let me times her before you marry her. You've had dinner with her 6 times. Dinner is a performance, Marcus. I want to see her when the curtain's down." He'd laughed at that, kissed his mother's cheek, and told her she read too many mystery novels for a woman who ran a Fortune 500 company. But 3 weeks later, when Marcus mentioned that the mansion needed extra household staff before the wedding, caterers, decorators, someone to help manage the chaos, Eleanor saw her opening, and she did not hesitate to walk through it. The woman who arrived at Ashcombe Manor on a grey Tuesday morning called herself Nora Bellwether. She wore a grey wool coat 2 sizes too large, sensible shoes, and a headscarf that hid most of her silver-streaked hair. Her hands, unaccustomed to labor, were wrapped in cheap gloves to hide the manicure she hadn't had time to remove. She had rehearsed the walk smaller steps, shoulders slightly bowed, the posture of a woman who had spent her life being looked past rather than looked at. Eleanor Whitfield knew how to command a room. Nora Bellwether needed to know how to disappear in one. The head housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Dolores, looked her over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen 100 hopefuls come through the servants' entrance. "You've done this kind of work before?" "My whole life," Eleanor said, and there was no lie in it, just not the kind of life Dolores imagined. Eleanor had built a company from nothing. She knew what it meant to scrub, to sacrifice, to disappear into work until the work became the only thing anyone saw. "Good. Mr. Whitfield's mother is very particular about staff," Dolores said, unaware of the irony sitting 3 feet in front of her. "Keep your head down, do your job, and you'll be fine." Eleanor almost smiled. Keep your head down. She'd spent 40 years making sure no one could tell her to do that. Now she welcomed it, because for the first time in her adult life, invisibility was exactly the weapon she needed. The mansion was enormous, a cathedral of marble and old wood that Eleanor herself had helped Marcus choose 3 years earlier, back when his success still felt new enough to celebrate with grand gestures. Walking its halls now as a servant rather than a guest of honor gave her a dizzying, doubled vision. She knew every room, every secret passage the architects had shown her in blueprints, but she had to pretend she was seeing it all for the first time. Her first encounter with Isabelle came on the second day, in the East Wing Library, where Eleanor had been sent to dust shelves that hadn't seen a servant's hand in weeks. Isabelle swept in wearing a silk robe the color of champagne, phone in hand, laughing at something on the screen. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. "Oh, hi. I don't think we've met." Her voice was warm, unhurried. She extended a hand, an oddly personal gesture for a soon-to-be lady of the house greeting new staff. "I'm Isabelle." "Nora, ma'am." Eleanor kept her eyes down, though every instinct screamed to study the woman's face for cracks. "Please, don't call me ma'am. It's weird." Isabelle laughed again, soft and genuine sounding. "Have you eaten?" Dolores runs everyone ragged and forgets people need lunch breaks. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yes, thank you." "If you haven't, there's a kitchen just past the east stairs. Help yourself to anything." "I mean it." Isabel's smile lingered a beat too long, or perhaps exactly the right amount. Eleanor couldn't yet tell which. "Marcus's mother is coming to inspect everything, I hear. So we all have to be on our best behavior." She rolled her eyes conspiratorially, as if Eleanor were an ally rather than the very woman she was joking about. "She sounds terrifying." "I've heard the same," Eleanor said dryly, and Isabelle laughed like they'd shared something. For the first week, that was the pattern. Isabelle was unfailingly kind. She remembered the housekeeping staff's names, brought coffee to the gardeners on cold mornings, insisted the caterers sit down and eat before they left instead of sending them off hungry. She spoke to Eleanor with an easy warmth that, if performed, was performed better than anything Eleanor had seen in 30 years of watching people angle for her money. By the 5th day, Eleanor found herself almost believing it. She began drafting, in her mind, the speech she'd give Marcus. "I was wrong. She's wonderful. Marry her with my blessing." Then, on the 6th night, everything changed. It started small. A door that should have been locked, standing open. A light in the East Wing library at 2 in the morning, when Eleanor, restless in her small servants' quarters above the garage, happened to glance out her window and see it glowing gold against the dark lawn. She told herself it was nothing. Isabelle was a night owl. Brides-to-be got sleepless before weddings. There were 100 explanations. But the next morning, dusting the same library shelves, Eleanor noticed something odd. An entire section of law books, untouched for years by the look of their dust patterns, had been pulled out and reshelved, slightly crooked, as though someone had gone through them quickly and put them back in a hurry. Estate law, inheritance law, trust litigation, strange reading material for a woman planning her wedding flowers. Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched. 2 days later, she was summoned to help move furniture in the East Wing guest suite room. Dolores explained that Isabelle had requested be kept locked and off-limits to staff, except for occasional light cleaning, supervised only by Isabelle herself. "Odd, isn't it?" murmured one of the younger maids, a girl named Priya, as they carried linens down the corridor. "She's the only one with a key. Even Mr. Whitfield doesn't go in there." "Maybe it's for wedding gifts," Eleanor offered, testing the waters. Priya snorted softly. "Wedding gifts don't need a woman crying on the phone at midnight." Eleanor's hands stilled on the linens. "Crying? I heard her once, when I was doing turn-down service in the hall. She wasn't happy crying, if you know what I mean." She sounded scared. Priya shrugged, the casual shrug of the young who hadn't yet learned to be curious about their employer's secrets. "None of my business, though." But it had become Eleanor's business the moment she put on that grey coat. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow servant's bed, running through possibilities like a woman doing due diligence on a hostile takeover. A hidden room, legal books on inheritance. A secret phone call that ended in tears, not celebration. Gold digger was the fear she'd carried into this house. But gold diggers didn't cry alone at midnight over inheritance law. Gold diggers didn't bring coffee to gardeners who could do nothing for their social standing. Whatever Isabelle Renard was hiding, Eleanor was beginning to suspect it wasn't greed. It was something else. Something that made the warmth in Isabelle's eyes look less like performance and more like a woman trying very hard to hold something together before it broke. Or, Eleanor reminded herself sharply, it was exactly the kind of thought a clever manipulator wanted a mother-in-law to have. Sympathy was the oldest disguise in the world. She needed proof, not instinct. And the locked room in the East Wing, she decided, was where she'd find it. 3 nights later, she got her chance. Isabelle left the mansion after dinner for what Marcus told the staff was a spa evening with friends before the wedding. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, the soft creak of old wood, the distant hum of the heating system, the click of Dolores's shoes fading down the west corridor as she made her final rounds. Eleanor waited until midnight, slipped a service passkey from the housekeeping closet that she'd noted Dolores kept unsecured, and made her way through darkened halls toward the East Wing. Her heart beating with an urgency she hadn't felt in decades, not since she'd staged her first hostile boardroom coup at 32 years old, terrified and certain all at once. The locked door stood at the end of the corridor, moonlight slanting faintly through a hall window onto its brass handle. Eleanor's fingers closed around the passkey, and that was when she heard voices low, urgent, coming from behind the door. Isabelle was not at a spa. Isabelle was here, in the locked room, speaking to someone in a voice thick with fear. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall beside the door, barely breathing, and listened. The first words she caught froze the blood in her veins. "He can never find out who I really am," Isabelle whispered. "Not now, not after everything." There was a pause, a second voice, muffled, male, that Eleanor could not place. Then Isabelle spoke again, her voice cracking. "If Marcus finds out the truth about my father, it won't just end the wedding, it could destroy him." Eleanor's hand, still gripping the passkey, began to tremble not from fear now, but from the sudden, dizzying sense that she had walked into a story far larger and far older than a simple test of a young woman's love. Eleanor stood frozen against the wall, the passkey biting into her palm, as the muffled male voice answered Isabelle from behind the door. She couldn't make out every word. The old walls of Ashcombe Manor were thick, built in an era when privacy was a luxury for the wealthy, but fragments reached her. "Can't keep running from it forever." "I know that," Isabelle snapped back, quieter now, as if catching herself. "But not yet. Not until after the wedding. Please." A long silence followed. Eleanor counted her own heartbeats, each one loud in her ears, certain that at any moment the door would open and she'd be caught crouched in the hallway like a common thief in her own son's house. Then footsteps moving away from the door, toward what Eleanor guessed was a window or a second exit on the far side of the room. She didn't dare linger to hear more. Whoever the man was, he was leaving. And if he came out through the corridor, she had no explanation ready for why a maid was standing motionless outside a room she had no business near. She retreated quickly, silently, back down the corridor the way she'd come, slipping into a shadowed alcove near the servants' stairwell just as she heard the soft click of the locked door reopening behind her. Back in her small room above the garage, Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed, hands still trembling, replaying the words over and over. "If Marcus finds out the truth about my father, it won't just end the wedding, it could destroy him." Not money, not an affair. Something about Isabelle's father, something dangerous enough to destroy her son. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the dark line of the mansion's east wing, and understood with sudden, cold clarity that she had uncovered exactly what she'd come looking for, and had no idea, yet, what to do with it. Eleanor did not go down to breakfast the next morning. She lay awake until the first grey light crept over the hedges, turning Isabelle's whispered words over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching. "My father." If Marcus finds out the truth about my father, she had come into this house prepared for the ordinary sins of the wealthy adjacent a woman marrying up, chasing comfort, perhaps hiding debt, or an old boyfriend she hadn't quite let go of. She had not prepared herself for secrets with the word "times destroy" times attached to them. By 7, Dolores was knocking briskly on her door, reminding Nora that the caterers were arriving at 8 and someone needed to help with the linens before the tasting for the rehearsal dinner. Eleanor pulled on her grey uniform, tied her hair back, and went downstairs to play the part of an invisible woman while her mind raced through everything else. The kitchen was already a storm of activity, trays of pastries, arguments over floral centerpieces, a wedding planner named Genevieve barking instructions into a headset. Eleanor moved through it with practiced blankness, the same blankness she'd once used in boardrooms to hide exactly how much she already knew before anyone else spoke. She watched Isabelle that morning with new eyes. The young woman moved through the chaos with her usual grace, complimenting the pastry chef, laughing at Genevieve's frantic energy, squeezing Marcus's hand when he wandered through looking for his missing cufflinks. To anyone else, she looked like a woman, deeply, easily in love. But Eleanor noticed things now that she hadn't let herself notice before. The way Isabelle's smile sometimes arrived a half-second late, as if she had to remember to produce it. The way her eyes flicked toward the east wing more than once during the morning, as though checking that the door remained closed. The faint shadows under her makeup that spoke of very little sleep. She's carrying something heavy, Eleanor thought. The question is whether it's a secret that threatens Marcus, or one that's simply breaking her. That afternoon, Eleanor found an excuse to linger near the study where Marcus was reviewing wedding logistics with his assistant. She busied herself dusting a hall table just outside the open door, straining to hear. Isabelle's asked that we not release any press photos before the wedding, the assistant was saying. No engagement announcements beyond what's already out. She's very firm about it. She's private, Marcus said, sounding faintly amused, faintly worried. Always has been. I used to think it was just modesty. Lately, I wonder if there's more to it. Have you asked her? I've tried. She changes the subject, says her family's complicated and she'd rather I meet them slowly, after the wedding, instead of throwing me into the deep end. A pause. I love her, Daniel, but sometimes I feel like I'm marrying half a person and trusting the rest will introduce itself eventually. Eleanor's dustcloth stilled on the table. Even her son, Sharp, guarded Marcus, who read every contract twice, had sensed the same fault line she had. He simply hadn't allowed himself to follow it as far as she just had. She wanted, more than anything, to walk into that study and tell him everything. The locked room, the male voice, the words about his own destruction. But she had nothing solid yet, only fragments overheard through a heavy door. Marcus wouldn't thank his mother for nearly ruining his wedding based on a hallway eavesdropping session. He'd accuse her, rightly, of seeing exactly the villain she'd expected to find. No, she needed more. She needed the whole shape of the secret, not just its shadow. Her opportunity came 4 nights later, in a way she hadn't engineered. Isabelle found her in the garden, of all places, near the old stone fountain that Eleanor herself had chosen when the property was landscaped. Eleanor was pretending to trim a hedge, using the shears slowly, unconvincingly. Gardening was not among the skills she'd bothered to research before taking on this disguise. You're doing that wrong, you know, Isabelle said, and Eleanor turned to find her sitting on the fountain's edge, still in her evening clothes, a glass of wine forgotten in her hand. I'm afraid gardening was never my strength, Eleanor admitted, which was, for once, entirely true. Isabelle laughed softly, but it faded fast, replaced by something heavier. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, the kind of look one gives a stranger when the walls have grown too tiring to hold up any longer. Can I ask you something, Nora? Of course. Do you think people can outrun what they came from? Or does it always catch up, eventually? Eleanor set down the shears, choosing her words with the same care she'd once used, steering multi-billion-dollar negotiations. I think, she said slowly, that most people spend their whole lives trying to answer that question, and the ones who lie to themselves about the answer are usually the ones who end up hurt the worst. Isabelle's eyes glistened in the low garden light. That's not very comforting. It wasn't meant to comfort. It was meant to be true. Eleanor studied her, really studied her, past the disguise of grey uniform and lowered eyes. Whatever you're carrying, Miss Renard, it's eating you alive. I may only be staff here, but I've lived long enough to recognize a woman drowning quietly so no one has to watch. For a moment, Isabelle looked as though she might actually confess everything, right there by the fountain, to a woman she believed was nobody. Her lips parted. Eleanor held her breath. Then, from the house, Marcus's voice called out, warm and unknowing, asking if Isabelle was coming in for dessert, and the moment shattered like glass. I should go, Isabelle said, standing quickly, wiping at her eyes before the tears could fully form. Thank you, Nora, for listening. Any time, Eleanor said, and watched her hurry back toward the golden windows of the house, back into the role of the radiant bride-to-be. That night, Eleanor made a decision. Fragments and instincts were no longer enough. If her son's future truly hung on whatever secret Isabelle was hiding, Eleanor would find it herself properly, thoroughly, the way she'd built an empire, through information, not assumption. She waited until the house slept, then made her way, once again, to the east wing. This time she did not linger at the door listening. This time she used the passkey. The locked room was smaller than she'd expected, not a bedroom at all, but a converted study, its walls lined with the same untouched law books she'd noticed before, plus something new. A corkboard, hidden behind a folding screen, covered in newspaper clippings, printed articles, and photographs. Eleanor's breath caught as she stepped closer, phone flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The clippings were old, some yellowed with age, dating back nearly 20 years. Headlines about a financial scandal. A man's photograph, distinguished, silver-haired, captured mid-stride, leaving what looked like a courthouse. Beneath his photograph, in smaller newsprint, a name Eleanor did not recognize, Gerard Renard, indicted on charges of securities fraud, Isabelle's father. Eleanor's mind raced, connecting pieces with the speed of 40 years spent reading balance sheets for the lies hidden in them. A financial scandal, a ruined name. A daughter who had, perhaps, spent her entire adult life trying to bury a past that could taint everything she touched, including, now, a wedding to one of the wealthiest men in the country. But as Eleanor's flashlight moved further along the corkboard, she found something that made the scandal look almost gentle by comparison. A more recent photograph, taken perhaps within the last year, of Gerard Renard, older now, thinner, unmistakably alive, standing outside a modest apartment building, clearly under some kind of surveillance, pinned beside it, a handwritten note in Isabelle's looping script. He's found me again. I don't know how much longer I can keep this from Marcus or from him. Eleanor's blood went cold. Isabelle's father wasn't merely a disgraced businessman from her past. He was, somehow, a threat in her present. And whatever he wanted, he had already found his way back into his daughter's life, right as she stood on the edge of marrying into the Whitfield fortune. Sleep never came for Eleanor that night. She lay in the narrow servant's bed with her phone clutched in her hand, scrolling through the photographs she'd taken of the corkboard, piecing together a man's ruin one clipping at a time. Gerard Renard had once run an investment firm in Geneva, well-regarded, quietly wealthy, until federal investigators discovered he'd been running a decades-long fraud that bankrupted dozens of clients, some of them elderly, some of them families who trusted him with their life savings. He'd fled prosecution, disappeared for years, and apparently resurfaced only recently, threadbare and desperate, hunting for the one asset he had left, his daughter and whatever proximity to wealth she now offered. By morning, Eleanor had built the shape of the story in her mind, though not yet its ending. Isabelle wasn't hiding greed. She was hiding times shame, times the shame of a name. And now, it seemed, the far more immediate danger of a father who wanted something from her marriage that had nothing to do with love. She needed proof of that last part. Suspicion wasn't enough to bring to Marcus. She needed to know exactly what Gerard Renard wanted, and how far Isabelle was prepared to go to keep that secret buried. The proof came 2 nights later, in the worst possible way. Eleanor was carrying folded linens down the east corridor near midnight, a genuine errand this time, one Dolores had actually assigned her when she heard raised voices coming from the same locked study. Not Isabelle and a hushed phone call this time. 2 people, in the room, arguing in low but furious tones. She set the linens down soundlessly and crept closer. "You don't get to just show up and threaten me," Isabelle was saying, her voice shaking with something that wasn't fear, exactly it was closer to fury held on a very short leash. "I built this life without you. I don't owe you a cent of it. You owe me everything." The man's voice was rough, weathered, carrying the ghost of an accent Eleanor couldn't quite place something European, sanded down by years of hiding. "Who do you think taught you how to charm your way into rooms like this one, Isabelle? You think that girl from Marseille just became times this on her own? Don't, Isabelle warned. Don't you dare talk about who I became. I became this in spite of you. Then you'll understand why I need 50,000 before the wedding and another 200 after. Call it a father's blessing. A short, ugly laugh. Or I make a call to a reporter I still know, and your fiancé finds out exactly whose daughter he's marrying and exactly how she paid her way into circles like this one before she ever met him. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. There it was not simply an old scandal resurfacing, but active extortion, playing out in real time inside her son's house, days before his wedding. I don't have that kind of money, Isabelle said, quieter now, and Eleanor heard something break slightly in her voice. Everything's tied up until after the wedding. You know that. You've clearly done your research. Then find it, or find a way to keep him from finding out what kind of woman he's really marrying. A pause, heavy with menace. You have until the wedding, Isabelle. After that, I stop being patient. Footsteps moved toward the door. Eleanor barely had time to snatch up the linens and duck into a side alcove before it opened, and a man stepped out into the corridor, tall despite his age, silver hair pulled back, wearing a coat too fine for a man who claimed poverty, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd slipped in and out of grand houses before. He disappeared down the servants' stairwell Eleanor herself had used only nights before. She stood frozen in the shadows for a long time after he'd gone, and through the study's open door, she heard something that undid every remaining doubt she'd carried about Isabelle Renard. Crying. Not performative, not delicate, raw, exhausted, sobbing. The sound of a woman who had spent years building walls around a life, only to watch them crack in a single conversation. Eleanor Whitfield, who had not comforted a stranger in decades, who had built her entire reputation on composure and distance, found herself walking toward that open door before she'd consciously decided to. Isabelle looked up sharply when she appeared, swiping at her face, humiliation flooding her features at being caught this way by, of all people, the maid. Nora, I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone was still... Sit down, Eleanor said gently, and something in her voice, some remnant of the boardroom authority she'd spent a lifetime perfecting, made Isabelle obey without question. I heard, Eleanor said simply. Enough of it! Your father, the money, the threat. Isabelle's face drained of color. Please, please, don't say anything. Marcus can't know. If he finds out I have a father like that, if the press finds out how you what? Eleanor asked. Quiet, careful. Isabelle's shoulders sagged, the last of her composure finally giving way. When I was younger, after he disappeared, after everything collapsed, I did things I'm not proud of to survive. I let older men pay for things. I learned to charm my way through rooms because it was the only currency I had left after he destroyed our name. Her voice cracked. I'm not the woman Marcus thinks he's marrying. I'm someone who clawed her way into looking like her. Eleanor sat down slowly beside her on the study's small settee, feeling, for the first time in this entire elaborate deception, the full weight of what she'd set out to test. Do you love my son? She asked quietly. Isabelle looked up, startled by the specificity of the question from a woman who was, as far as she knew, simply staff. More than anything I've ever had, she whispered. That's what makes this unbearable. I was finally becoming someone real with him, and now my father's going to burn it all down because I can't buy his silence. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, the smeared makeup, the trembling hands, the terror of a woman who had built an entire persona out of survival, and was now watching it threaten to collapse the one genuine thing she'd found inside it. Isabelle, Eleanor said finally, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Everything is going to change very soon, and I need you to trust that when it does, it isn't the end of what you've built here. Isabelle frowned, confused by the strange authority in the maid's voice, the odd formality of her words. Nora, what? Eleanor reached up and, with one motion, pulled the grey scarf from her hair, letting silver waves fall free in the way the world actually knew them, the way photographs in business magazines knew them, the way Marcus had known them his entire life. My name isn't Nora, she said. It's Eleanor Whitfield. I'm Marcus's mother. The color drained entirely from Isabelle's face. You're She stood up so fast, the settee creaked. "You've been for 2 weeks. You've been times living times here, pretending to be—" "Testing you," Eleanor said, without apology, though something in her chest had softened considerably since the day she'd walked through that servant's entrance. "I needed to know who you really were before I let my son marry you. I did not expect to find what I found." The study door burst open before Isabelle could respond, and Marcus stood in the frame, still in his shirt sleeves, drawn by the sound of raised voices at this hour. His eyes moved from his sobbing fiancée to the unfamiliar authority in the maid's stance, to the silver hair now unmistakably framing a face he'd known his entire life. "Mom?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "What? Why are you dressed like—" The house, which had kept its secrets so carefully for 2 weeks, was about to hold none of them any longer. "Sit down, Marcus," Eleanor said, steadying herself for the conversation that would either save her son's future or shatter it completely. "There's something you both need to hear, and I think finally, it's time all three of us heard the whole truth together." Marcus didn't sit. He stood in the doorway, looking between his mother's unfamiliar grey uniform and Isabelle's tear-streaked face, and for a moment the only sound in the room was Isabelle's ragged breathing. "Somebody explain this to me," he said quietly. "Right now." Eleanor stepped forward first, because whatever came next, she owed him the truth without softening it. "I disguised myself as a maid 2 weeks ago and moved into this house to watch Isabelle when she didn't know she was being watched. I didn't trust that she loved you for the right reasons, Marcus. I needed to see who she was when no one important was in the room." His jaw tightened. "You spied times on my fiancée, in my own house." "Yes," Eleanor said without flinching. "And I found something I didn't expect." Isabelle wiped her face, steadying herself with visible effort. "Marcus, there's something I should have told you months ago, about my father." Her voice shook but held. "He's a con man, a fraud, disgraced years ago, and he's resurfaced. Tonight he was here, in this room, demanding money and threatening to go to the press about my past if I didn't pay him before the wedding." Marcus's expression shifted from anger to something more complicated shock than a dawning, protective fury that had nothing to do with his mother's deception and everything to do with the man who'd made Isabelle cry alone in a locked room. "He was times here? Tonight?" "I heard the whole exchange," Eleanor confirmed. "He's using her past against her. Extortion, plain and simple." "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked Isabelle, though the anger in his voice had already softened into something closer to hurt. "Because I was terrified you'd see me the way I see myself when I think about him," Isabelle said. "Ashamed. Used. Not good enough for a family like yours." Marcus crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "I don't care what your father did or what you did to survive him. I care that you were carrying this alone." He glanced up at his mother. "And I care that apparently the only person who noticed was doing it in disguise." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. Someone had to. By morning, Marcus had already called the family's legal team. Gerard Renard's history of fraud made him easy to deal with through official channels, a call to the authorities who'd been quietly searching for him for years, followed by a restraining order that made any further contact a swift path back to prison. He was picked up 2 days later at a motel outside the city, his brief reappearance in his daughter's life ending exactly where it had always been headed. Eleanor, for her part, finally shed the grey coat for good, though she kept it folded in her closet, a strange souvenir of the only role she'd ever played that had actually mattered. "I owe you an apology," she told Isabelle, the two of them alone in the garden by the fountain, this time with Eleanor dressed as herself silk instead of wool, diamonds instead of a cheap wedding band imitation. "I came into this house looking for a woman chasing my son's money. I found a woman who'd spent her whole life running from a father who tried to make her believe that's all she was worth." "You could have just asked me," Isabelle said, though there was no real bitterness in it anymore. "I could have," Eleanor agreed, "but I don't think you would have told me the truth. Not yet. Some things people only reveal when they think no one important is listening." Isabelle managed a small laugh. "You were listening the whole time." "I was," Eleanor said, And what I heard convinced me of something I couldn't have learned from a single dinner, or 100 of them. You love my son. Not his money, not his name him. That's rarer than you'd think in circles like ours. The wedding took place 3 weeks later than planned, delayed just long enough for the legal matters to settle and for Isabelle to stand at the altar without a shadow trailing behind her. Eleanor sat in the front row, no longer in disguise, watching her son marry a woman who had passed the only test that had ever truly mattered, not the test of kindness to a stranger, though she'd passed that too, but the test of what she was willing to endure and hide and survive for the chance at something real. As the vows were spoken, Eleanor thought of the grey coat still folded in her closet and found she didn't regret a single day she'd worn it.